Okay, thank you. Thanks for having me along. Really pleased. As I mentioned, as Kathy and I were talking about there, I've been involved on and off with the work of Fathers Network Scotland for a long time, and Fathers Network Scotland were really helpful and supportive in helping shape some of our thinking around how we can support early years settings, I guess, in particular, to work better with dads, to make sure dads feel more included within the setting. And that's all informed a lot of the work that we've done. So what I've done today is I've just pulled together some slides, and the plan, I guess, is to give you a little bit of a flavour of the approach that myself and my colleague Barbara have been kind of championing for a few years now. Go into a little bit of the background of that. It's basically the aim of what we are trying to do is to ensure that children are not limited by harmful gender stereotypes. So I'm going to show you what we mean by that, why we think that this stuff is harmful and why we need to do something about it, and then provide some food for thought, I guess, about the ways that anyone really who comes into contact with children can provide new messages and kind of counteract some of the messages that the world gives children about what is for them in terms of their gender. And yeah, so hopefully there's something useful in here. I've also included a few slides on dads specifically, including some information of some work that I did a few years ago, research looking at dads and their experiences when they became fathers in terms of the support that they were given. So I've just slid that in there, and I am keen in particular if anyone has any thoughts in particular about the impact of these kind of stereotypes on dads in particular as they become parents, and what are the pressures that are facing men and dads around these kind of gendered issues. So I'll pick up on that as we go later, but I'll just share my screen if I can do that. Here we go. Now, why is it doing that? Hold on, you can see that, can you? I'm going to stop it again because I think I've done it the wrong way. Here we go. Can you see my notes, or can you just see the screen?
We can see your notes on your screen. So what you're doing last was better.
Okay, sorry. This is when this is when it's clear that it's a while since I've done a Zoom meeting. We always use Teams these days in the NHS, so that's why.
That's all right.
Here we go. Beginning.
Brilliant. That's it.
Okay, that's it now.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So my name's Susie Heywood, and I work. Well, myself and my colleague Barbara have kind of formed a little organisation called Gender Friendly Scotland, and I guess our aim is just to share some of these messages as widely as we can. So I'm just going to take you through that just now. So I guess before we start, it's probably quite useful to think about what we mean by gender stereotypes. If the whole point of our approach is about reducing these, it's probably quite useful to explain what we mean by these. So this probably won't be new to you, but I guess we like to think about gender stereotypes as boxes that we tend to place people in. It's a way, I guess, it's part of the way our brains work and help us make sense of quite a complex world, is to categorize things and place them into boxes that help us kind of simplify information. But these can be harmful, they're quite simplistic. So in terms of boys and girls, we place children from quite an early age into these boxes. We begin to divide the world into two, and we place a whole load of things in one box, the boy box, and a whole load of things in the girl box, and these are what we would call gender stereotypes. So sorry, I'm just going to move this down. So I guess another way to think about a stereotype are just, when we take a whole load of people who share a characteristic, so in this sense it's being a boy or being a girl, and assume that they also then share a whole load of other characteristics. Now, we've just put some random things in the box here to kind of demonstrate what we think are some of the common stereotypes that we hear in the world about what it means to be a boy and what it means to be a girl. And I'm sure that you all will know children who fit quite neatly into these boxes, but likewise, I am sure you know many children who also don't. And that's because these stereotypes are unrealistic. They're simplistic ideas of people. We don't fit into these boxes. And I guess one of the key points is that stereotypes are harmful. And if they're left unchecked, they can lead to unfair treatment, harassment, dehumanization, pressure, abuse, discrimination, particularly for people who don't fit into these boxes, as we'll hear about shortly. They also, we believe, uphold a culture of gender inequality, which kind of places much more value in that boy box or that man box compared to the girl box. And it fuels issues, some of the issues that we see in society, such as gender-based violence, gendered issues such as high male suicide rates, which we'll touch on again later. And all of these we see as a kind of result of some of the stereotypes, but also the inequality that they cause. And I guess one of the key points that we like to make is that these stereotypes have the potential to harm all of us. So it doesn't matter if we're a boy, a girl, or a man, or a woman, or anything else. It just doesn't, these have a negative consequences for us all. And as I said, we might see some truth in the boxes. So we might actually look at if we're with a class of children, and we might actually think, actually it seems to be that boys are this way, or girls do tend to be a certain way. And so we do see some truth, I guess, in some of these boxes. Certain traits may be more common. But I think it's important that we ask ourselves why we might see these. So first of all, there's been lots of research done looking at these differences, so research into brain development, things like that. And what we see is that while there will be differences between boys and girls, maybe if thinking about brains, there might be slight differences between boy brains and girl brains. Those on average differences tend to be rather small, but if you plotted everything onto kind of a plot, then the overlap between them can actually be quite big. And what we like to think of is that actually some of these small biological differences are exacerbated by the kind of gendered socialization and nurture and experiences that we expose children to throughout their lives. And I'm going to go on in a minute to show how we do that. So that you'll be familiar with the kind of whole nature nurture debate. So I don't think it's as simple as that when it comes to gender differences. But I think the way that I think about it is that there are small natural differences, some small natural differences, but it's the nurture stuff that exacerbate these and make them appear much bigger than maybe they might already be. And I'm going to kind of take you through just a few slides. We usually use a whole load of slides for this, but I'm just going to take you through a few just now that kind of hopefully demonstrate the ways in which we think this happens. So right from the time that a baby is conceived, actually, and through those early days, we can already see quite big differences in the way that they are treated, depending on whether they are a boy or a girl. So even before baby's born, if we know that they're a boy or we know that they're a girl, as adults, the aspirations and the imagined futures that we have for that child, the characteristics that we expect that they'll have, the way that they even act, you'll hear people say, no, they're doing a lot of kicking in there, it must be a boy. These things are all kind of done through those kind of lens of gender stereotypes, unconsciously often, but it's there because we've grown up in this highly gendered world. And then when they're born, there's lots of evidence, and there's just a few studies here, but there's lots more that show that when we are aware of the sex of a child, that as the adults, we adapt and change our behaviour in line with some of those stereotypes. Again, most often unconsciously done. So there's studies that show that adults think that little boys have more physical capabilities than little girls. There's studies which show that in general, adults talk more to little girls, and in particular, those words to describe emotions and talking about emotions, we do that a lot more with little girls than we do with little boys. We interpret the way children cry, young babies cry differently depending on if they're boys or girls. So already we can see those differences. And then when it comes to even the things we buy for them, the toys that we buy for them, the way we interpret the way that they react to those toys is all done through that gendered lens. And then it continues as children get older and they begin to kind of look at the world around them. And we know that young children, when they're just developing, one of the ways that they can help make sense of the world is placing people into categories. And one of the most obvious categories that they see in the world around them is dividing things into male and female. And so they're already looking for clues and messages about that and already beginning to associate themselves with one category, even by the time they're the age 2 or 3. You know, it's really already by that time we see children kind of understanding these groupings. So then when they become a little bit older and start kind of exploring the world a bit more, there are lots of places where they get these messages, and kids TV here is one of those places. So we quite often ask people to, we spend a lot of time actually unpicking this slide, but just to summarize it, I guess, quite often people talk about the whole pink and blue divide, and yeah, that is an issue, the whole pink things for girls, blue things for boys, and the way that we divide the world into two and we market things towards one or the other. But in terms of kids TV, yes, we do see that. But for me, some of the more problematic stuff is around representation and what's shown here. So very often, and there's evidence, there's a really good report by an organisation called Hopster that was done in 2019, and they looked at representation in children's TV in the UK, and they kind of confirmed a lot of the things that we were already seeing. So we see a lot fewer females in leading roles. We see a difference in the kind of characters or characteristics of male and female characters. So generally, boys and men tend to take those more leading, more active, more aggressive, perhaps, roles, whereas females tend to be the sidekick, a bit more passive, a bit more decorative. We see a real lack of kind of caring male figures within children's TV. And likewise, I think we're better actually at those kind of more active female roles than we are with those caring male roles. Very often there's just a lot more male roles than female roles. So quite often within like a group of characters, there'll be mostly male, and then you'll get the token female role. Paw Patrol is quite a good example of that. And I guess for us, and you probably know a lot more about this than me, but in terms of that, what we know about how children learn through play and role play, you know, we're already beginning to divide up the world, divide up opportunities, and kind of send messages to children about what's expected in the way that they should be, which we then see in the way that they play. I know as a parent, I see that kind of thing with my young children, and particularly when they were a bit younger and into things like Paw Patrol, you know, I could see that already my daughter was being quite limited in what she was able to do through that sort of thing. And it's not just TV, it's everywhere. So we see it on toys and clothes, that sort of thing. You'll be familiar, if you're on Twitter, I'm sure you've come across a lot of this stuff before, but that idea that you go into the supermarket, the slogans that are on t-shirts are very gendered. You know, quite often with little girls, it's like, oh, happy and smiley, love, cute, pretty, sparkly. And with boys, it's much more about action and adventure and you know, dinosaurs rather than rabbits and things like that. It's already, the world's been divided into two. Let Toys Be Toys, if you're at all interested in this, are a great organisation and have a really brilliant website with loads of resources and things. What they did was an experiment where they looked at TV advertising on children's TV, and they pulled out some of the key words that were being used and the key messages in toy adverts for toys, which were being clearly marketed either towards boys or towards girls. And then they put these word clouds together. Now, these are better than they used to be. They repeated this in 2021. They did it before in 20, I think it was 16. And we've seen a little bit of an improvement, but even with these new supposed better adverts, hopefully you can still see how the themes of these adverts and the things that are being marketed to children are still aligning along these quite stereotypical gendered lines. I've just got a few more slides on these, but I left this one in, even though it's getting on to kind of more of the adult stuff, and we do spend a lot of time going into actually how these stereotypes accompany us right throughout our lives. But I think masculinity and how masculinity is portrayed across the media is a really interesting one. And we use this example to show how a kind of change over time, I guess. So with a very familiar figure, we've got Batman here, and this was Batman from the 1950s, and then the kind of Dark Knight character that we're more familiar with now. And I think hopefully it's pretty obvious, you can see the difference here. Batman on the left could be anybody's dad in a bat suit. The one on the right is this very, very different character that portrays, I guess, some of what some people believe to be some of the more problematic masculine aspects, you know, so darkness, violence, you know, unapproachable, unemotional, and these things that we're really trying to kind of move away from when we're trying to demonstrate that there are so many other ways to be a man. Yet these characters are kind of reinforcing this tough guy idea, and there's loads of evidence. There's a guy called Jackson Katz in America who's done loads of work about this tough guy stereotype and the way that the media in particularly continually reinforces this message that, you know, if you're a man and if your masculinity is in any way threatened or compromised, that you can adopt this tough guy persona as a way of kind of bringing it back and showing your masculinity again. And this stuff has an impact on children, because we know that children play and role play these roles. We'll all have seen young children in the park, you know, wearing these puffed out padded superhero suits, you know, and we could talk about the impact on that on boys' feelings about their own bodies as they grow and the expectations about body image. But yeah, we could be here all day talking about that. And I guess it's not just there. So I included this just because it's such a recent example, and I think it's quite an important one, and it shows that this stuff is really everywhere. And actually it reminded me a lot of the Fathers Network Scotland work that they did way back around the Where's Dad, where they looked at representations of dad across official documents and showed that actually dad was quite often missing or represented in a kind of negative light. So this was an advert that came out during the height of lockdown from the government down south, asking us all to stay at home, and was very, very quickly withdrawn, because hopefully you can see the problem with this, and that, you know, it shows women in a variety of domesticated roles, looking after children, cleaning the house, doing the ironing, holding the baby. And the only place that we see the man is sitting on the sofa watching the TV, what we can presume. And rightfully so, this was very quickly withdrawn. But for me, what it showed was that I'm pretty sure even in the height of the pandemic that this would have had to have crossed a few desks to get signed off, yet nobody picked up on the fact that this was really reinforcing the stereotype of who was doing what during that time, and just in homes generally. And I think it's a good example of how that unconscious bias, that those messages that we have in our brain about men and women, sometimes we just don't even pick up on it. So yeah, a really useful example, but thankfully was taken down, I think, within like a day or two of it being released. So this, I guess, is just because we grow up with these messages, all of us have grown up in a world that has told us this, and whether we're aware of it or not, and then we continually reinforce that, I guess, to the next generation without even realizing it. So the stuff that we say, and I left this in because I just think that this idea of language being important, I think, is key. The throwaway comments, the things that we say, the boys don't cry, they come on, be a brave boy, you know, that's not for you, you're a girl. These things just continually reinforce these messages that children are getting from the world around them. And I just think that it's important that we consider the things that we can do to make a difference, because this is like a drip, drip, drip effect on children as they go through their lives. And by the time, and I'll show some evidence for this, you know, by the time they're older, that we see children kind of seeing their aspirations as being restricted. So things like the world tells little girls, for example, that that the STEM subjects in school are not for them, and that bears out in what we see in terms of STEM careers. And likewise, little boys are kind of socialized to away from those kind of caring, nurturing, empathy type skills. And then we see actually a real lack of male representation in the caring professions and nursing in early years and teaching, these sort of things. So these things matter. And I just left this one as well, just to kind of demonstrate how, I guess, those stereotypes that we project onto children then kind of become these boxes that impact on us when we become adults. So we've got here the man box and the woman box, and I don't need to go through them. You'll be familiar with these stereotypes, but hopefully you can see how the roots lie in those really early stereotypes. The boys don't cry, or the well-behaved girls, they sit up and listen, put your hand up, little girls. The roots of that are there in the early years, and so therefore it's important that we can get in early and get some of those messages to children. So why are we talking about this stuff? My background's public health, so why do I think that it's important that we do something about this? So the reason that we started doing this work, I guess, was because myself and Barbara were doing a lot of work around some of these issues in terms of approaching them from a public health perspective. So Barbara was doing a lot of work around gender-based violence and violence against women and girls, and looking at ways that could be prevented, and that could, that support could be given to people experiencing these things. I was doing work around suicide and mental health. At the time, I had just finished a project looking at suicide rates in men and what we could do to promote positive mental health around men. And I'm delighted to say I think we've made huge progress as a society in that. We've got some really excellent projects now, really working with men to kind of move away from those stereotypes of, those strong, silent, unemotional males. But we see these stereotypes really as having a real role in creating some of these issues, either just through making them worse or actually being at the root cause of some of these. And the stereotypes and the inequality that the stereotypes create can be creating some of these issues. So, for example, homophobia, transphobia and biphobia is a huge issue, and is still a huge issue. And we know that those gender boxes, the man box and the woman box, are very much rooted in the idea of kind of heteronormative relationships. So there's an assumption there that men and women are different, and that they will be together, and that they will have children. And it's rooted in that kind of heteronormative idea of what it means to be a man and a woman. And people who are LGBT plus people do not fit within those boxes. So those are people who are living their lives out with those boxes and actually facing a whole lot of backlash because of that. So if we can dismantle those boxes, then we would think that we would see a lot less homophobia, transphobia, biphobia in the world. And I could go through all of these and pick them out, but obviously I don't want to take up too much time. But hopefully you can see how these gender stereotypes might be impacting on some of this stuff. And I think this is a good example of why this is an issue for all of us, because these are not just issues that affect one type of person. These are issues for all of us, and we really ought to be concerned, and we ought to feel that there is something that we can do about them around these gender stereotypes. So I guess just in terms of dads specifically, what are some of the stereotypes? You'll be well familiar with this, so we've got the hapless dad, the angry dad and the missing dad, these stereotypes that we've worked so hard to kind of get rid of, yet we know that dads are still impacted by some of these gendered pressures, the traditional masculine expectations. So even despite all the progress we've made in kind of changing that idea of what it means to be a dad, we know that dads still feel some of these pressures. So I've just put some of them here, and it would be great to think if you've got any thoughts or experiences around this or any additional ideas. But that pressure to be the provider, that pressure to be the strong one, the one that's there to support mum, the one that holds it all together, is still very much there. the pressure to be different. So we know that men quite often feel the pressure to be different maybe from the previous generation of dads, and that's a good thing, but it's also just an additional pressure because they're also then dealing with all of these gendered pressures that still kind of uphold that old idea of what it means to be a man in a household and in a family. And I guess that pressure to be a role model for the new generation, and I don't think this is just an issue for dads, because certainly I feel it as a mum. I feel that I have a responsibility to model all the ways of being a mum, and that mums can do everything, and yet that brings with it a whole lot of guilt, because yes, I want to be with my children and I want to be an active best mum, but I also want to show them that my career matters to me, and that women can go out there and that they can achieve. And all of that just brings a whole heap of pressure. And why is it we just can't be content to be the way that we are without all those pressures? And this kind of bore out, I guess, in the research that I did back in 2017 with dads in the northeast of Glasgow. And the whole point of that was to explore what were some of the challenges, social and emotional challenges, that faced dads as they became fathers for the first time. And I was particularly interested in where they received support. And I guess these are the four key themes that came out within that research. And within all of them, actually, we saw some of themes around this gendered stuff coming through. So that despite knowing and acknowledging that fatherhood and the idea of being a dad was changing, the dads still reported feeling constrained by those traditional masculine stereotypes. And those particularly seemed to impact on the way that they felt able to seek support when things were not going great. And they did talk, when probed, it didn't come naturally, but when probed, they did describe feelings of stress and anxiety and pressure and depression, yet very, very few of them were able to describe times when they actually sought some support with some of that stuff. And very often they felt that that was because there was this expectation that they were there to be the support for mum. And they spoke about, this society, services and supports which prioritise the needs of mothers. And they actually all said, that's the way it should be. But actually they all felt that they were at a disadvantage because of that. Going along to groups, parenting groups, they felt that were prioritised towards mum, that all the support given by medical professionals they felt were geared towards the partner rather than them. And we know that actually since this was done, there's been loads of great work. Fathers Network Scotland, one of the leading people in this, to kind of really work with professionals to identify the needs of dads and to make sure that dads is looked after too. And in terms of the support that they did get, because they did get some support, but it was always much more ad hoc. They were at work, they received a phone call about their child and they happened to get into a conversation with a colleague about it, or they just so happened they were out for a pint with their friends and it came up in conversation. But it usually focused around the practical things rather than those kind of social and emotional difficulties. And there was still a tendency towards finding your own coping mechanism and kind of dealing with it on your own rather than sharing it with other people. Okay, I guess it's just important to note that gender and gender inequality is only one of a range of inequalities that impact on us all. So I just, and even within those gendered categories, there are stereotypes even within them. So for example, there are specific stereotypes or issues that face Black men in particular, or working class men. So we can't think about it just as simple as gender. We need to also realise that there are a whole load of other things that are having an impact there. So I guess most importantly, what can we do about it? And the whole point of our approach is that this is not about getting rid of gender completely. This is not about creating gender neutral environments and pretending that gender doesn't exist and that there is no such thing as being a man or being a woman or being a boy or a girl, because then we can't actually make a difference, because the world is not a gender neutral place. The world is heavily gendered. So what we tend to advocate for is equitable approaches. And what that means is, rather than just treating everyone the same, it's about understanding the disadvantages that different people and different groups face, and trying to give them exactly what they need to then be able to achieve the same as everyone else. So yeah, so it's not about, if you're thinking about it in racial terms, for example, you may have heard that idea of being colorblind, you know, and how that's not a good thing. We shouldn't be colorblind. We need to understand that, you know, there are particular disadvantages and particular messages out there about Black people, and actually we need to provide the counterbalance and level things out. So that's really what's at the heart of our approach. So what can we do then about this stuff? What does that translate into in terms of our practice and the things that we can do? So of course we want to, and we kind of advocate for minimizing these stereotypes wherever we can. But this is not about getting rid of any book in your bookcase that is stereotypical. This is not about making sure that your children don't watch Disney or don't watch the programs that are more kind of stereotypical. Because actually these are useful, and we can have conversations using these resources with children that can gently challenge those stereotypes. So I do it with my children quite a lot. You know, they're probably fed up with it by now, where maybe we're reading a story and I'll notice actually that all the characters are male, or that the female character is the only one that's doing this, and I'll kind of raise that with them and help them to notice that and say, what do you think about it? Do you think that's fair? Why don't we change some of the characters around and see how that feels? And just playfully, I guess, kind of challenge these stereotypes. Because what we know is that the way our brains work is that even if we see these counter stereotypical examples, so even if we read the story and the main character is a little boy who is caring and kind, children have, and actually all of us have, a kind of habit of misremembering that. So they might notice it at the time, but if you were to ask them about it a week or so later, they might remember that story quite differently. And actually they might remember that character as being a female, because there's a tendency for us to forget those counter stereotypical examples because they don't confirm, I guess, what we expect of the world. So I guess we have a responsibility to point those out and really show, like, so if we're seeing a really good example of, you know, here's a boy in a real caring role, then let's use that, let's point that out, let's have a conversation about that and help children to notice that, and help children, I guess, to develop the skills to be able to notice that themselves, and I guess notice the stereotypes when they see them. So representation is really important, and for little boys particularly, but all of us, I think it's really important that we see people of all different genders undertaking a whole lot of different activities. And I guess it's about looking around, looking at the world around us and looking for those examples, and using stories and books and anything that we can find to just have those conversations with our children, pointing out the stereotypes to them and helping them to notice them. I think as well, thinking about those, what we know the world is already telling young children about the way that they should be, particularly young boys. We know that, and even by nursery, they're already kind of understanding that they should be a certain way in terms of being stronger, not crying. These kind of messages are still out there. We're getting better, I think, but they're still out there. So we maybe want to think about how we can encourage little boys in particular to spend more time to talk about emotions. And so, yeah, there are lots of ways that we can do that. In terms of discipline, I'm not going to go into this in any depth, but what we know is that there are ways, because of the ways we expect girls to behave and boys to behave, it can really impact on the way that we deal with them and poor behaviour. And this can have an impact on their self-esteem. It can place pressure. You know, we expect little girls to behave themselves, so we kind of really hammer down on them when they don't, because they're kind of stepping outside that box. And sometimes with little boys, yes, we of course give them into trouble when they're naughty, but very often and sometimes there's a tendency to kind of wave it away as it's just boys being boys, it's just boisterous boys. And actually, what messages are we sending to children about what we expect? And I guess the other thing, and what we know is that the best way to kind of counter these biases and these stereotypes is exposing children to a range of diverse experiences and people. Things that can encourage them to kind of build friendships and develop empathy for people who are not like them, teaching them care and respect for everyone. And so really, really proactively looking at how we can increase diversity and diverse interactions in our children's lives. And that's not always easy, but I think it's really important. And then finally, how can we model healthy and respectful ways of being and relationships to our children to show them that as adults, you know, that we treat everyone with respect, and that our relationships are relationships of equality within the home, I think is really, really important. And I guess at the end of all this, this is the aim, isn't it? And I think there's a lot of things that people can disagree on around some of these issues, around some of the public health issues. People come at them from different places. But I believe that we can all congregate around this simple idea of not limiting children and helping and making sure, I guess, that all children are able to aspire to do or be anything, and that we shouldn't divide the world into two by the time that they're born and kind of push them down these certain paths. Actually, we can just let children be children, and we can give them the tools and the skills to be able to challenge these unhealthy, I guess, stereotypes themselves as they grow older, because until we can change the world around us, we know that they're still there. So we need to kind of proactively give children the ability to be able to recognise and challenge these. So that's me. Thank you for listening. These are my contact details, and I am happy for anyone to be in touch to find out more about what we do. We're working on a book just now that we hope will be published towards the end of this year, which really goes into this in a lot more depth and explains, I guess, where we're coming from, looks at some of those public health issues, and specifically pulls out some of those actions, those equitable actions that we can take around this. So do look out for that. It's geared towards early years professionals, but I believe that the messages and the learning and it's applicable really to anyone who comes into contact with children at any age. So thank you for your time, and yeah, look forward to a bit of a discussion. Hopefully we've got time left. Yes, we do. That's good. And hopefully that there was something in there for you.
Well, thank you so much, Susie. I personally have loads of questions. It was really, really interesting talk. Oh, sorry, bashed my knee there. I'm just wondering, Una, you had a question about whether the divide between girls and boys with colour differences was something that's universal, or is this just a Western idea? And I don't know whether you're around, Una. Do you want to
yes, I'm here. Sorry.
Talk a little bit more about that, or ask Susie yourself?
Yeah, I suppose I should state my bias is anti-Walt Disney and the plastic that goes with Disney. So I'll just say that before I start. But I'm just interested in whether other cultures, other nations are in, or do they have an equivalent of the pink and blue in colour differentiation? I'm just thinking of,
I think that's
really children from other, maybe Africa or India, and pink blue doesn't seem to apply.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would be as pronounced, but the reach of Disney transcends nations and borders, and I think we can see that. And interestingly, I met yesterday with an academic whose specialism is Disney and Disney princesses in particular, and she has a book coming out next year which will be absolutely brilliant on that stuff. But I guess what we know is that, so pink and blue hasn't always been a thing here. It's quite a recent phenomenon. In fact, it used to be flipped. So red and pink used to be a boy colour because it was associated with the military, and blue was for girls, and it was associated with more calm, the Virgin Mary dressed in blue. So that's been a relatively recent flip. And I think for me, it shows that these ideas are not fixed, and ideas about gender and the things that we place in those boxes do differ quite significantly between cultures across time and place. But yeah, I guess in terms of the pink and blue, my guess, because I don't know, would be that no, it's not quite as pronounced. And I think a massive part of it in my opinion, is to do with marketing and the toy industry, and how we are able to then divide everything into two, so that as a parent, if we have a boy and a girl, we have to buy two of everything, and you know, so a bit of capitalism mixed in with that. But the colours themselves are not the problem. It's just when we then divide them up and ascribe them to boys and girls and put a whole load of other things around them.
I have a question for you, Susie, and hopefully we've got lots of people in the room who work with dads and mums and children in the early years, and there's a nice split of men and women who work in the early years, and that's unusual, I would say. And you were talking earlier about active female roles, and actually we're seeing more of those kind of active female roles in the media. So instead of just the sort of princess being there at the behest of the prince, we're now seeing active female princesses going out and doing daring things. But there's that, you were talking about that lack of active caring roles in men, and it made me start thinking about men in the early years and that role model, having male role models in the early years. And obviously we've got some, so Greg from Dad's Rock, Graham from Circle, we've got lots of guys here who are involved in the early years or involved with kids in the early years. And I'm just wondering whether we can have a discussion around what attracts men into those positions. How do we keep men in those positions? How do we act as role models within those services? And I know you've done a lot of work on this, and there's a lot of people who are actively involved, both men and women, in those areas, and it would just be good to have a chat about that, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I'd be keen to hear people's thoughts. I mean, there's so much, I guess, that I could unpick around that, and particularly, yeah, I think as a society we're really getting so much better at promoting different ways of being a female, but really not as good at promoting different ways of being a man, and we could unpick why that is. You know, going back to those boxes, we tend to place so much more value as a society on those the things in that male box. So actually there's something aspirational about women aspiring to be more like men. It's not accepted the other way around, and we know even with young children and young boys, gender is much more heavily policed on boys than on girls. So we know that boys are much, whenever we talk about with nurseries and things, the examples they give are always the problem with the little boy that wants to wear the dress, or the dad that comes to pick up the little boy and he's pushing a buggy. That nobody has a problem with little girls, you know, building with Lego or wearing like high-vis jackets and pretending to be a builder. It's always the other way around. And I think we continue to see that actually throughout society, actually, is that there just seems to be more of a reaction against men that step outside the box, and I think that bears out. And we've spoken to men who work within the early years who have given it up because it's just been too hard. I mean, their mates just think it's a laugh, or, you know, or they're the only one within their setting, and it's really hard being the only guy because of all the pressure on them. And finally, before I hand over to see what other people think, I think that idea of a role model is important, and we hear that a lot about, and it's important in the early years that children are able to see both men and women doing a variety of roles. So we encourage settings who are lucky enough to have a man to ensure that they are not just doing all the kind of stereotypical male stuff, the rough and tumble and the football. And we want children to see that men can be caring. But in terms of role models, we also want to realise that men are not just role models just because they're men. They can be role models because of the qualities that they bring, and those don't need to be along those stereotypical masculine lines. So a man can be a really strong role model without being good at football, or without being the one that does the rough and tumble. We can value more. It's about more than their sex. It's about them and their personality. So we can have a man in the nursery who's a terrible role model, you know, and likewise with women. So yeah.
And I think Una, you had another good point about this, and I guess it's borne out with the dad surveys that we've been undertaking over the last couple of years, I suppose now, during COVID. It's almost been a couple of years, can you believe it? But the number of men who've stepped up into that caring role during COVID obviously has increased enormously, absolutely enormously. And those dads, certainly from what we can see, want to remain really a significant part of their children's lives, and they want to be caring for them, they want to be there for them. And I guess a question is, how do we as a group, so as a group of professionals, help them fulfill that? How do we include them in nursery? So how do we get dads involved so they're present in those environments? Have you got any kind of thoughts about that? And or Una, do you want to say anything more about that?
No, you've just described what I was thinking, and how we try not to go back to the old ways. I think a lot of people are thinking, you know, once COVID's over, everything will be all right. And they mean by all right, we'll go back to where we were before it. And I think we might miss a chance to do it differently because of what men have experienced, and not to waste that. I suppose back to public health and what we were hearing, where health education or health promotion and mental health promotion could be helped by that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that early years were already quite good at this stuff in terms of dads. Certainly our experience working with nurseries was that, you know, they were very welcoming of dads, and already I think kind of really understood the role of dad. But I think it'd be interesting to talk to them now and see how that's changed. But I absolutely agree. I think we don't want to go back to the old normal, but I'm not keen on that new normal. But I think there are certain things that we want to kind of hold on to, but dads have always, I think it's not just a COVID phenomenon. I think certainly when I spoke to the dads, that was what they wanted. They wanted more time with their children. They hated the fact that they were out at work all day and that they were missing these milestones in their children's lives. And despite the kind of moves that we've made as a society to kind of introduce better paternity leave, shared maternity leave, all these things that were put in place, I think these stereotypes were still making men feel unable to actually uptake that, or businesses were just less forgiving of men who wanted to kind of take on that role, or just don't understand why a man would even want to. Like, why would a man even want to stay at home with their children? You know, I think we can do so much better, but hopefully organisations like Fathers Network Scotland will be on it, and
trying our best.
Yeah. And yeah, I think
to actually identify dads only, or not dads only, but starting with men together for some activities, so that they don't become the only man in the group. I'm thinking of things like toddler swim sessions, where I can imagine you would feel quite awkward with a whole lot of ladies in swimsuits jumping about the pool, and you're the only man being.
Yeah, good point. I think so. To me, that's equity. That's because if we're talking about equity and equality, if we just say this is a swim session that's open to mums and dads, that's equality. But I don't think that's going to get dads, as you say, because there are these other barriers. So personally, I think that yes, we need to think about father-specific groups at time if we're really, because we're not there yet as a society. And once we get there, maybe we won't need that anymore, and it'll all be great. But we need to recognise the reality and kind of tailor our responses accordingly. I don't know if anyone else has got any thoughts about that. Obviously recognising that, you know, not all families have dad, not all families have mum. There are all sorts of families out there, and we need to make sure that everyone's catered for and that everyone is able to kind of be that involved parent in their child's life.
There was an interesting point that Chris Scott put in the chat box. Chris, I'm just wondering whether you can, whether you'd be happy to just share your thoughts.
Yeah, sorry guys, I've coughed now. So I mentioned that there's a big thing amongst working class men, is that sort of riddy culture, where it's like anything, and I mean literally anything outside of these sort of really rigid and strict lines that are sort of been predefined since God knows when, especially like in working class areas. Anything outside of that is just met with like jokes, slagging, even abuse in some cases, you know. And it's like when you were talking about the like men working in nurseries, like if I'm 35, if when I was in school, if any of my friends said, "Oh, I'm going to go and work in a nursery," like you can only imagine the sort of abuse they would get. And it's that thing where it doesn't matter what it is. It's like these lines are so strict that any deviation, any sort of movement towards them is met with just this. It's constant. And a lot of the time it's not even bad natured. It's not even meant to be like hurtful, but there's just this, because we're so, I don't know, for lack of a better way of putting it, men of a certain age, and we're really emotionally illiterate, if that's a way of putting it. So we don't know how to like say, "Oh, that's really different. Like, what made you do that?" Rather than say that to someone, we slag them for it, and then and it's not meant to be bad natured, but it's just like that's how we interact with each other for the most part a lot of the time.
Banter,
yeah.
Banter.
And that's something that really needs to, and I hope it's a lot different for younger men nowadays. But I mean, I don't know how much it is.
I think that we're still got a long way to go around that. And I think that's why I think it's important to, as well as just eliminating these stereotypes and things, we need to kind of teach children kind of these skills to kind of begin to challenge. And there's great work being done around kind of helping children to be upstanders, to call out things like that, to not be afraid to kind of be different or challenge things and challenge behaviour amongst their peers. And that's continuing right up, you know, into adulthood. And there's all great campaigns just now looking at how men can be challenging poor behaviour amongst other men. And I guess this idea that within a group, yes, there's this banter, but probably everybody gets that it's not acceptable and that it's not kind, but yet nobody's willing to be the one that says, actually, I'm going to give him a break. Like, it's great what he's doing, but actually they're probably all thinking it. So there's a bit for me about how we reframe bravery, actually, and how we reclaim that idea of being a brave boy, because being a brave boy isn't about being emotionally strong, and it's about being able to challenge and not being afraid to kind of go against the norm. And I think if we can really work on that with children, I think we could make some difference. But I'm with you, Chris. I think that the culture is so ingrained, particularly within working class men. I like to think that change is possible. I come from a public health background. You know, we've seen that change is possible. We've seen us make massive differences to the way that we approach tobacco within Scotland, which we would never have thought was possible. But that was only possible because we looked at it at all different levels, you know, legislation, practice, culture, challenging cultural norms. And I think that's what we need to do here. And we're already seeing a little bit of that. We've seen legislation that's looking at making sure gender stereotypes aren't perpetuated within adverts. So it's happening, but it will be slow. But the more of us that's talking about it, and the more of us that aren't afraid to just say, you know, pack it in, that, you know, give them a break, that's a shame, then the better.
That's great. Thanks, Chris. That was really, really insightful. I'm mindful of time. We're getting close to 11 o'clock. And before we go, a couple of things. First of all, it'd be great if you could do the evaluation. I'll put it in the chat box in a minute. And also, I think our chair of the board is on the call, Willie Campbell. But we're oh, there's Willie.
Okay, thanks.
We're actually looking for members of our board at the moment. So I'll maybe just pass over to Willie just for a couple of seconds, just to talk a little bit about FNS and maybe just a little bit about what we're looking for. And then we'll finally just have maybe one last question or one last thought on today's talk, and then we'll wrap up. But I'll pass over to Willie if that's okay, just very quickly.
Very much, Kathy. Yeah, apologies for coming in very late to the discussion, but I'm fascinated by what I was able to hear of it. At least I don't, with you, have to to the people who gathered here, have to describe much about Fathers Network. You're aware of the organisation and what we do. We're looking to refresh our board. We're about 9, I think, strong at the moment, and we have a fair range of backgrounds and skills, but there are there's always 1 or 2 gaps, but not only that, we want to make sure that we're always having new blood come in. One of our particular gaps, for example, is we're terribly East Coast dominated in the board member.
Willie, I think you've got your finger over the mic.
Oh, have I?
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yep, that's better.
All right. Well, that tells you I didn't know where the mic was. Right. In case you missed anything, first thing I said was I'm sure you all know what Fathers Network is and does, so at least I don't have that particular hurdle to go through this time. Our board is 9 strong, thereabouts. We have a good range of background, but obviously we want to keep refreshing. And we are at the moment very sort of East Central focused in where most of our board members live. And we tried and hope to serve all of Scotland. And particularly now in the days of Zoom, for example, even if we did tend to meet in Edinburgh, no reason why somebody can't be coming in from Inverness or Thurso or wherever. So a simple request is, if Kathy were to send you the link, I'd be delighted if people could share that link for our advert for new board members, including, I hope, a new chair. I don't want to leave the board, but I've been chairing it for 5 years, and that's long enough for any kind of good governance. So if you were in a position simply to share the link to the Good Moves advert we have out for new board members and potentially a new chair, I'd be very grateful, because if it hits all of your circles, it will certainly reach far more potential people than simply us sending it around ours. It would be a big help to us, because we do want to be, as far as we can possibly manage it, an organisation which is solid and secure in having the balance of skills we need on the board, and having them there should we lose anyone. And there's always the great risk in a small organisation that you're very, very much at risk from one person going out of the door for whatever reason. And so it would be a big help to us if you would be prepared to simply put it into your own LinkedIn or your own Facebook or whatever and share it around any contacts you think might actually bring something. It's not a big commitment. We ask people to be in meetings. I suppose a couple of hours every 6 weeks to 2 months is the minimum we need from people. But if folk are prepared to do more, obviously we don't dissuade that. So, however, and many thanks today for that fascinating discussion. Sorry I didn't hear all of it, but what I did hear, as always, makes me feel excited about being involved with Fathers Network.
Thanks, Willie. That's great. Thank you so much. And I've just put the advert into the chat box. I think there was one question. I don't know whether Lord is still online.
No, I think they've gone. But I think his point is good, and hopefully from what I've discussed, you can see that this is that eliminating these gender boxes and stereotypes or challenging them is a beneficial thing for men too, and hopefully will help men to feel more secure. And it's not about talking about masculinity as being a negative thing, because I think that can put off a lot of men, particularly when you start talking about masculinity being toxic. It's just about reclaiming that, being able to see the positive sides of it, but also demonstrating that there are so many ways to be a man, and it's not confined to just these narrow confines that we've constructed. And rightly enough, we know that these are contributing to big issues for men. We know that 3 times as many men die by suicide in this country as women, and we know that that is partly to do with the way that we socialise and raise our boys and our men to be a certain way. So this stuff can help all of us. And then I see that Una said about someone in the SFA changing to a pink strip. Well, I actually know someone who's just about to take up the post of equality and diversity lead for the SFA. So I will let her know and suggest that that might be something that she could put in place.
Fantastic. Well, I think we've run over time as usual. We normally run over time because they're so fascinating, all the talks. But I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time out, Susie. We really appreciate it. As you know, as you said right at the start, we've had a long-running relationship with you over the years, and it's so important to keep talking about this subject. And it's, as you said, it's a big tanker to turn, this one. But certainly I think that I'll take away that notion of reframing bravery. Really, I think that's the one thing that's really my takeaway. And I just want to thank you and thank everyone else for coming along today. We've got another DADx in another 2 weeks. It'll be a meetup with dads and family workers. So a chance to have a chat and share your practice and what's been going on for you. So more of that in the next week or so when we get ourselves together and get that publicized. But I just want to say a massive thank you to you, Susie, and to everyone else for coming along, and hope to see you all in another couple of weeks. So thanks again.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and do get in touch, anyone, if you've got any particular thoughts or want to chat about anything more. I can talk about this all day.